It began with the cancellation of the basic income pilot in the summer. It continued with a 100-day review to assess what reforms were needed to overhaul what the PC government called a disjointed patchwork system of social assistance. And last week, that new plan was unveiled with promises it would restore dignity and encourage employment. Here to give us their assessment, Mary Marone. She is Director of Advocacy and Legal Services with the Income Security Advocacy Centre. Kyle Vose, co-chair of the ODSP, that's the Ontario Disabilities Support Program Action Coalition. Susan Cada, Child and Family Sector Manager with Toronto Council Fire Native Cultural Centre. Deb Hutton, former Senior Advisor to Premiers Mike Harris and Ernie Eves, now a columnist at QP Briefing. And Sean Speer, Senior Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And we're happy to welcome everybody around our table here at TVO tonight. There is a great deal of background I suspect that our viewers will need in order to understand the conversation to come. So, Sheldon, let's go with these graphics here. This is going to take a while, but hang in there, everybody. The government of Ontario says 1 in 7 Ontarians, 1 in 7, lives in poverty. More than 960,000 Ontarians use social assistance, and it breaks down like this. About 445,000 are on Ontario Works, which provides financial assistance to people as they look for a job, and 515,000 are on the ODSP, the Ontario Disability Support Program, which, as the name suggests, provides income and employment support to those with disabilities. The province is projected to spend more than $10 billion on social assistance in this fiscal year. That's 2018-19. That is 6.25% of all government expenditures for that year. And it breaks out to more than $5.6 billion for ODSP and more than $3 billion for Ontario Works. Currently, for a single person in Ontario, the maximum someone can get from ODSP is a little over $1,000 a month. For Ontario Works, it's a little over $700 a month. Only 1% of social assistance recipients re-enter the workforce in a given month. Half the people that leave Ontario Works return to it, and 80% return within a year. Okay, that is some of the background. Mary, I want you to start us off here. We're talking about a system that I gather has 800 rules, 240 different income support rates. We have had politicians from all parties over the years call it confusing, complicated, disjointed, that it doesn't work. How did we get to such a situation in the first place?
Well, social assistance has a decades-long messy history, so I'm not going to go there. But I'll start with the programs that we have now that were introduced in the late 90s by the previous Conservative government. I think it's fair to say those programs were considered harsh and punitive. There were a lot of new rules brought in to restrict people getting onto the program, and it was characterized by frequent penalties. You wouldn't get your benefits because you've broken one of those new rules. And they criminalized behavior that previously had been encouraged. So if you were on Ontario Works, you could no longer apply for a student loan and go to post-secondary. If you did, that would have been, there was someone who was charged with fraud for doing that. Then under the Liberals, we had a long period where they kind of softened some of the edges, and sometimes in response to human rights challenges. With each softening, that's yet another new rule. So over time, you end up with this complicated
patchwork,
rule.
complicated situation.
Yeah.
Okay, Deb Hutton, I'm going to go to you next. Obviously, Mary is kind of taking aim at the government that you were a part of. You advised Mike Harris and Ernie Eves on some of those changes. What's your response to what you just heard?
Well, it's been 17 years this winter since Mike Harris left politics, and we're now on our 4th premier since then. So I think it's a bit rich to blame where we find ourselves today. And where I will agree with Mary is that we have a patchwork system and it needs to be fixed. But it's a bit rich to go back and blame the Harris government. It also ignores the fact that the Harris government did something that I think we can all agree was a smart thing, which was to remove those persons with disabilities from the welfare rolls. Because when Harris came into government, everyone was on the same system. And that didn't make sense because you have able-bodied people for whom the goal should be employment, and you have others for whom employment is a lot harder to get to because of disabilities.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on. The Liberals were in power. Kyle, I'll bring you in at this point. The Liberals have been in power for 15 years. We heard Mary say that they beveled some edges, but frankly didn't improve things too much. What's your view on the last 15 years?
Well, it's true that we did have some struggle with the Dalton McGuinty era. We had some fights and challenges with him. They wanted to cut things like special diet and that, and we had to go to the communities and fight and advocate for it. But this last Liberal government, we had a minister that understood what the issues were, had worked in the community, and so she was one of the most supportive ministers we had at the time.
Which minister is this?
Jazik.
Helena Jazik.
Yeah, okay. and so we got a lot of work done through her. In fact, some of those issues that we had gotten pushed through, like last year when we had met with her, because she realized, what if we don't get into power, what can we do? So we went and came back with some rule changes that could be easily changed for them. And so that was what was put into the budget. And those are some of the things that were being held back, like changing of the spousal rule and advocating that, $500 of earnings and then 50% clawback after that.
We're going to pick up on that because there have been some changes to those rules. From a public policy standpoint, Sean, where do you think things are at right now?
I think the catalyst reform is not just the patchwork in and of itself or even the cost of this program. Both of those things merit discussion, merit attention. But the real scandal here for me is the numbers you described at the outset. The retention, the failure to move people into employment. As Deb says, the principle of Ontario Works, of social assistance for able-bodied people, ought to be temporary, ought to be transitory, and it ought to be a human scandal, that we have such high retention rates. We're not just failing taxpayers, more importantly, we're failing those people who we know from a wide body of research the broad-based benefits of work, the financial benefits, of course, but the non-financial benefits are just as important. And so I think the directional changes that the minister articulated last week, the extent to which it restores the principle that Ontario Works ought to be transitory, ought to be temporary, ought to be focused on promoting and supporting paid employment, I think is terribly needed. And as I say, goes beyond any fiscal considerations or design considerations. This is about humans. This is about people.
We will highlight some of those changes in just a second, but we haven't heard from Susan yet, and I want to hear from Susan. In this regard, would you agree that the system should be considered a failure by virtue of the fact that we now find ourselves with multiple generations of people living on social assistance in the province? If the idea was it should be temporary respite and then ultimately get people back to work, if we're into multiple generations of people on social assistance, do we agree it's failed?
I would definitely think that, yes, it is a failure based on that. You have households where the parents are on assistance, and then because there's just not enough money, that they don't have enough to live on, they're not thriving, they're just in survival mode, then that goes down to the next generation. So now you have these young children who are living in poverty that are coming up, and now they're also on the system. So it's becoming cyclic. So something needs to be done, and we're failing these people.
Well, you said something needs to be done, and here is what the current Ontario Progressive Conservative government has decided. Sheldon, let's bring up this graphics package if we can. They say this will roll out over the next couple of years, and some of the key changes are as follows. In the lead up to last week, the PCs eliminated the basic income pilot. As we heard over the summer, it was providing 4,000 people with a monthly minimum income. It was created by the previous Liberal government. PCs also cut a 3% planned increase for Ontario Works and ODSP. That was promised by the Liberals. They cut that increase to 1.5%. Now, changes to Ontario Works. Recipients will now be able to earn up to $300 a month without reducing their assistance. That's up from $200. Right now, their benefits are reduced by 50 cents for every dollar people earn over $200 a month. Now, they can earn up to $300, at which point they will see their benefits reduced by 75 cents on every dollar as opposed to 50. They launched a website, the government did as well, to match job seekers and businesses. And let's do one more graphic here, and these are now the changes planned to ODSP, the Disability Support Program. They are aligning, the Ontario government is, the province's definition of disability with the federal government's. We'll come back to that because that's a big change. Recipients will now be able to earn up to $6,000 annually without reducing their assistance, rather than the current $200 a month. And then beyond $6,000, benefits will be reduced by, again, 75 cents on every dollar. And financial eligibility for ODSP will be reviewed annually rather than monthly. Okay, there is a lot to kind of review there, so let's start reviewing. Mary, out of all that information, what's the headline in your view?
Headline is no immediate disruption to people's lives who are on the program, but deep cuts coming for new applicants in the future and possible cuts coming to current clients of both programs.
Let's continue. Deb Hutton, the headline for you.
Encouraging welfare to work.
Period, full stop.
Period, full stop. It does it both with those on Ontario Works and those in ODSP.
Kyle.
We're going to continue with the Mike Harris Deny by Design 2.0.
What does that mean?
Means that we're enhancing what Mike Harris started out by designing this program to deny the people that need it most, and now we're just added an extra point to it to make it even harder to get into the program.
Sean.
I would say back to basics for Ontario social assistance, by which I mean a restoration of the principle inside Ontario Works that it ought to be a temporary transitory program to paid employment, and a refocus of ODSP to focus resources, to target resources for those most in need.
Susan.
This is more of a been there, done that. I have a lot of the clients that come to our center, they're worried. They are stressed out because this is what they had seen before with the Harris government, and now they think that it's just the same again.
Is that, okay, come on in on that, because that's
I'm
the
struggling with
observation you
that.
hear.
I am struggling with that. So this is the first across-the-board increase for everyone in Ontario Works and ODSP at the same time in 15 years. That is a fact. Secondly, this allows greater earned provisions than existed under the Liberals.
Meaning you can earn
It
more.
does. It does.
You
The
can earn more
Liberals-
before you start
Let's be very clear.
getting clawed back.
Exactly. The Liberals for 15 years had 15, 14, 16 budgets. Sean will tell me which number. Many, many budgets to make changes to how much you could earn back. They did it on the eve of losing an election they knew they were going to lose. So you can't line what the Ford government is doing up against that budget. It's not fair because those changes were not going to come in. They were thrown out there at the last minute. This is against status quo, and it is an increase. As well, the Ford government at the same time has made changes to the income tax system. So you are able to pay less in income tax as you work for those who are on minimum wage. That goes hand in hand with the welfare change.
May I just add to that, Steve? The other limit, I think, to comparing to the 1990s is that we can't look at these changes in isolation. We have to look at the broader tax and transfer system that's evolved considerably since Mr. Harris's time in office. Not only is there the tax changes that Deb's talked about, in the intervening time, we've seen the creation of the Canada Child Benefit at the federal level, the Canada Housing Benefit, the Canada Student Grant Program at the provincial level, the Ontario Child Benefit, and so on. And so I think when we're talking about the generosity of our income support system, to look narrowly at Ontario Works and ODSP fails to recognize that the system has become much more generous, much more targeted, and much more sophisticated in supporting people as they move through this process of hopefully transitory poverty in instances for able-bodied people, and more generous support for those with disabilities so that they can live lives of dignity.
Susan, fair point?
Well, I was reading through it, and the plan does sound like they are trying to get people back into the workforce through broadening more of the social service part of the program itself. To me, that means that they're actually going to be integrating what I do as a frontline worker into what they're doing as the social service worker. That would be good. That is something that needs to be looked at, because a lot of the one complaint that I hear from a lot of our clients is they're not looked at as a person. They're looked up as a file number. They're looked up as a bottom line. And they want to be seen as people. They want to be seen as, we're not lazy. We want to work, right? And it's just that the system right now is not, it's very complicated. There are a lot of hoops to jump through, and they don't want that. As Indigenous people, we already feel that there's, that we're not looked upon, we're not consulted, we're not treated equally. And then when you hear a mother coming to me and saying that I need help because I got cut off from assistance. Like, well, why did you get cut off from assistance? Because I couldn't make my meeting, my child was sick. I called my worker. And it's just instances like this, and we hear, and I understand they are a case-by-case system, but when you hear it very often, it becomes a problem. And we hear it a lot from Native clients. So we're thinking that it's more of I don't want to say a race, but it's looking like discrimination.
Let's get some feedback to that.
So where I agree with Susan is the notion, obviously, that individuals need to be looked at for their individual circumstances. And the good news is Minister MacLeod said two things that I think addresses that very, very well. One is that there will be a greater reliance on individual action plans so that it actually does speak to the individual. And she talked about that last week. The second is the notion that we start greater local delivery so that local communities will actually be able to adapt the system to their local needs. Those are two very important things that Minister MacLeod spoke about last week.
Can
That
we all?
actually divides us.
Kyle, go ahead. Kyle and then
That
Mary.
actually divides us more up than that brings us together as a coalition. And we find that because that becomes more patchwork now. Because you're actually talking about the program being patchwork, you're actually creating it more patchwork. So a couple of things I want to correct. So first of all, you said back in before Mike Harris days, there was no disability. There was, because I was on family benefits. And that was different than being on welfare. So you got a little more money because you were sick, and so that was a program that changed to becoming ODSP.
But you
So
were
there
still
was
on
a
the
program.
welfare rolls, and
But
that's what the
but
Harris government
ODSP
changed.
and OW is still under social assistance. It's still coming from the same pool of money. But what they do is they divide the groups up by sending the money out and then make it discretionary benefits that you have no way of what's the word I'm looking for?
Appealing?
Appealing, thank you. Of appealing and getting results. If they decide to deny you, they deny you. And so then you're not accessing that program. So if this government was really concerned about getting people back to work, they would also stress the fact of volunteering. Like how many people, I've gotten a job because of volunteering. How many more other people would be able to get into the community and volunteering if we acknowledged them and gave them a little bit of extra? There was nothing in the budget mentioning that. And the clawback that they're talking about, we're actually losing more money now than we are before. So it was 75%. If they kept it at 50%, then I would agree with you that we are earning a little more money and bringing us closer to the poverty line. But the amount now is not actually bringing us any closer to the poverty line.
Mary?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on the earnings exemption. It's not true that you get to keep more. You get to keep more as long as you're only earning under $500. So you get to keep the first $300, and then you only get to keep 25 cents on the dollar. So once you've hit the $300 mark, if you get a minimum wage job, you're working for $3.50 an hour.
But the
when
status
you're
quo
over-
was 200, correct?
Yes,
That's
but at the
where-
$500 mark, once you're making more than $500 a month, you get less. You will get less than you get today.
Right.
So it's only true that you get more if you're earning less than $500 a month.
We should clarify this because there's a lot going on here. The previous government clawed back less after you reached a certain threshold. This government will claw back more, but this government will let you earn more before the clawback goes in.
Right.
So is it fair to say the jury is still out on which set of figures is going to allow you to keep more at the end of the day?
No, it's clear. As long as you're earning under 500, you're better off under the proposed rules. If you earn more than 500 a month, you'll
have
be
been better
worse
under the
off.
old rules.
That's right.
And that's not even taking into consideration housing and rent geared to income.
So at the end of the day, Sean, was this done to save money?
I don't think so. I no doubt the government has been clear since its election that there was going to be a fiscal lens applied to government programming and services. I don't think any viewers would be surprised by that. But I take the minister for a word. I take her at her word. That having looked at the programming since taking office, she identified many of the issues that we've been talking about, and you showed in your introduction. Not just the extent to which the system failed to treat people as humans, as individuals, and with unique circumstances, whether it's mental illness or substance abuse or the need for work training and so on. But also the fundamental point that the system was failing to do what it's supposed to do, which is to help people transition out of poverty into paid employment. The changes around the income thresholds, we can debate whether these particular changes are right. I'm open to an argument that they ought to be more generous. But as I said earlier, I think you need to look at it holistically, including the LIFT tax credit, which was announced in the fall economic update, which will essentially eliminate income taxes for anyone earning under $30,000, as well as other programming, including the enhancement at the federal level of the working income tax benefit. So when you look at it holistically, I think net, I think the minister can look Ontarians in the eye and say, fiscal considerations were secondary. This was really about improving programming for Ontarians most vulnerable.
Okay, but if we discover, let's say a year or two from now, when the Ford government is still in office, that in fact the changes to when clawbacks happen and how much will be clawed back actually makes this program less generous than its predecessor, would you then argue for changing the rules to make it more generous?
Not just that. I think the one thing where we would all agree upon is that there's a lot of outstanding questions here. We talked earlier about how this new local orientation is going to play itself out and how it's going to operationalize itself. The ministers talked about wraparound services, which I suspect we would all agree with as well, ensuring those on Ontario Works have greater access to mental health support, substance abuse support, employment support. But how those details are going to operationalize themselves are also an open question. And finally, the question of health savings accounts. It was reflected In the background materials, we don't have a lot of information about how the health savings accounts are going to work. So there's no question that the minister is going to be subjected to real questions, and ultimately the proof will be in the pudding. But as I said earlier, I think directionally where the government's headed makes sense to me, both on normative grounds, but also on empirical grounds.
Mary, I want to follow up on one other thing that we saw in those charts that we just brought up, and that is the Ontario government is changing the definition of what it means to be disabled to align with the federal government's definition. And the initial feedback that we've received to that change is that it will invariably make it harder for people on disability supports. Is that your understanding?
That is the biggest concern about this package of reforms. The federal definition is severe and prolonged. It's even narrower than that if you look at the whole thing. But the ODSP is designed to help people with episodic disabilities, with shorter-term disabilities, a catastrophic illness that lasts a couple of years, you'll still be covered for ODSP.
So a broader range of possibilities, in other words.
That's right. And the new definition is clearly narrower. It will clearly exclude people. I've heard it'll exclude a lot of people with mental health disabilities, anyone with an episodic disability who has some capacity to work for a while and then might relapse and need to come back. They will not meet the new definition. I've heard that it's up to 35%. If you look at the current range of disabilities on the program, about 35% of them will not be eligible. I don't have the evidence for that.
Well,
let me just finish this point.
No.
If you don't qualify for ODSP, you'll go on to OW. So you're going to lose over $400 a month over the person who's on it today. So that's a huge rate cut for the person who no longer meets the definition, still has a disability. That's a 35% rate cut. And the 5-10 years down the road, Ontario Works will no longer be for the people who are ready to go into work. Already we have many people with disabilities. The great thing about the wraparound programs is that it recognizes that there are people on OW now who have some distance from the labor market and need a whole other range of supports. Agreed. So I completely agree with you that that is a good direction. But in 5 years, this is going to be the new disability program. The majority of people on OW will be people with disabilities. So the question really is, are these changes enough to serve properly people with disabilities?
I don't want to be overly partisan about this because I don't like it when everything is looked through a partisan lens, but you're going from a conservative government in the province to standards that are put in place by a liberal government federally. And, the conventional wisdom would say liberals are always more generous when it relates to social assistance than conservatives are. Conservatives get a bad rap on a lot of this stuff. And yet you're saying by going to liberal standards, it's going to be worse. Is that a tough sell?
Well, we also get told a lot of the times when we go to the federal government that because it's transfer payments, we need to speak to the province. It's no different than when you're talking about passing it down to municipality. Then we get told by the province, hey, what with this money? And we get down to the municipality. It just gets pushed back and forth. We don't like the fact that it's going this way. And it makes a huge problem, especially for my community. I work with the HIV positive community and people that need medication. And if they're being pushed to OW and they get forced to get a job, and if their job doesn't have benefits, how are they going to get their medication coverage? How are we assuring that these people with mental health are getting their medication coverage? Because what ends up happening is they're not going to be on meds, they're going to get sick and back on the system again. So we have the system just repeating itself like it is now, just at a deeper level.
But it sounds like you're saying liberals federally are no more generous than conservatives provincially.
Yeah. They don't want to spend the money either. Like, in some ways, they don't want their rules. They don't want to affect the provincial disability rules. They want to be their own rules.
Okay, let's hear from the minister at the center of all this, Lisa MacLeod, who represents a riding in Eastern Ontario. She's got a lot of portfolios, actually. She got
women,
community and
children,
social services, women, children, youth.
immigration.
Anyway, she's got a lot going on. When she made the announcement last week, here is what she said. Sheldon, if you would.
When people can work, they want to work. Our current social assistance system, built under the Ontario Liberals, fails to recognize this. Their system discouraged initiative, and their system rewarded inaction. And cynically, it left people dependent on government and trapped in a cycle of poverty. That's why I'm proud, very proud, to stand in front of you today to announce a renewed social services approach to social assistance.
Mary, how much of what she said is true?
Which part?
Well, let's start with, the accusations against the Liberals that they essentially kept a cynical system in place.
Oh, that's absolutely true.
That is true.
I'm not defending what the Liberals have done in the last 15 years. I'm profoundly disappointed that they didn't do far more to fix a terrible system. Whether the proposed system will be a lot better, we'll have to see. I think what they're doing with OW, I applaud. Many of us have been asking for those services for years, but it presumed that you had the same disability program to stream people through who needed it. And when you take that away, you've lost a key part of the social safety net.
Deb, in your view, how long is too long for somebody to be on Ontario Works?
Well, I fundamentally believe in the notion that it should be a temporary program. And I think when you see that we have people, a large percentage who are on more than 5 years, that says to me that the system is failing. It's failing us as taxpayers, and it's certainly failing the people who are in this, not just as Susan said earlier, one, but multiple generations. That's just, it's a bad system if that's what it is doing.
Sean, 80% of the people apparently who get off OW are back on it within a year. What does that tell you?
It tells us we're failing them. But we're not, as I say, we can debate about income thresholds, we can debate about the generosity of the program. I think all of those things ought to be on the table. But ultimately, the question is it serving its principal purpose, which is serving as a temporary transitory program to help people into paid employment? And that statistic shows that it's not. And so the question is, how can we do better? And we've talked earlier about the Wraparound program, recognizing that a paycheck in and of itself isn't going to solve the problem, that we need to help people deal with the other issues that are precluding them from obtaining employment. And oftentimes we know that those involve mental health supports, substance abuse supports, employment training, reskilling, and so on. And I think, as I said earlier, I think this starts to move things in a positive direction. Can I just make one comment? We talked earlier about the changes to the disability definition, and I understand the anxiety in the disability community, and I think there is an onus on the government to bring clarity sooner rather than later what their expectations are and how the redesign will affect the disability community. I could just say, from my experience in Ottawa, the lack of alignment in definitions for disability programming at all levels of government is a source of confusion and anxiety. We established in Ottawa, as you know, the Registered Disability Savings Plan. It was a priority of the late Jim Flaherty. And we often heard the struggles that people had in obtaining an RDSP because of eligibility issues, because the entrance point was the federal disability tax credits. You had to be eligible for the disability tax credit to then be eligible for the RDSP and a whole host of other benefits. And so, as I said earlier, I think the government does have an onus to tell the community what this is going to mean for them, but the principle of bringing alignment to definitions of disability for the purposes of public programs, I think is, at least at a conceptual level, the right thing to do.
Understood. Okay, let's get into something very ticklish here. And that is, it's almost 4 decades ago, when Ronald Reagan was running for president of the United States, that he talked about the so-called welfare queen who showed up in her Cadillac to pick up her welfare check. And probably since then, there has been a lot of, excuse me, a lot of allegations about waste, fraud, and abuse of the welfare system, and about how many people who are on it don't really need to be on it, but are gaming the system. There was never any evidence, incidentally, that welfare queen of Ronald Reagan's actually existed, but the story was too irresistible not to campaign on. How much abuse is happening in the system today? Susan, start us off.
I'm going to say that there probably is abuse in the system. There has to be. Just because the amount of funds that a person gets, it's not, you can't live on that. The cost of an average one-bedroom house, one-bedroom apartment in Toronto is like $1,500. But the max you get total, this includes money for food and for clothing and other expenses, is just over $700. How can one survive on that? So unfortunately, people are looking for other ways, and that needs to be addressed. There needs to be something done so that people aren't looking for those other ways. They're trying to find work and stuff like that.
Okay, let me go to Deb Hutton next. When you were in government, when you were advising premiers, when you presumably had a chance to actually look into this, how much waste, fraud, and abuse was there actually?
Well, I'm actually going to separate them out a little bit because there is fraud in the system, which is complete fraud. And I'm not pretending it's rampant, but there is fraud in the system.
Who's defrauding whom?
Well, I think there are people who make claims that aren't true, and that is true fraud. And again, I'm not suggesting that is a big chunk of the system at all. But then there is what Susan just spoke about, which is abusing the system because it allows you to abuse the system, because either rules are such a patchwork or our caseworkers are overloaded and can't actually make sure that the people who most need the help are getting it, et cetera. So that's very different than fraud. And I think those who work in the system would tell you that, for the very reasons Susan just spoke about, that is fairly rampant. Now, you can argue whether or not it's okay. I argue it's not okay. The system is designed by government to work a certain way, and it should work that way.
But when
I need
it's
to jump
broken,
in
it's
here.
broken.
Okay,
I need to
go
jump
ahead,
in.
Mary.
Abuse is not rampant. What you have is a series of rules that people are struggling to understand, including the caseworkers. And the stat that is often brought up is the number of overpayments that are in the system of people owing money back to government. And they tend to conflate an overpayment with abuse or fraud.
Can you just explain how that works? Why would there be an overpayment?
The system is designed to generate overpayments. Any month that a dollar comes into a household that's on social assistance, that dollar is an overpayment that needs to be repaid in the next month. People have to report any source of income every month and report it in. And if it gets reported in, it's deducted from your next check. There are many situations where people report in sources of income. It doesn't get input into the computer. And then all of a sudden they owe $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. So these are errors made by caseworkers. Sometimes it's about different caseworkers having different definitions of how the rules work. One caseworker tells you something is okay. You get a new caseworker. It's like, oh no, that should never have happened. You shouldn't have been getting that money. You owe us $20,000. So that's how it works.
That much ever?
Yes.
That happens.
Sometimes 50. So this happens all the time. So it's impossible to pay back. But the bigger issue is, how often is government collecting money on those overpayments that are not actually owed? It's the computer that generates the overpayment. The computer decides whether or not you owe money. And the letter is generated by the computer. Unless you appeal, I'm not sure any human being ever looks at those numbers to see if they're accurate. When you appeal, we discover that often those numbers are completely inaccurate and they get reduced or they disappear. Or it's an administrative error that the appeal tribunal will say, you shouldn't have to pay this because the system made a mistake. So I think, and if you don't appeal, I'm not sure a human ever looks at it, but they start collecting, and that's a collectible debt. So I would like the Auditor General to look at how often is government collecting money from recipients of social assistance that they're actually not entitled
Well,
to.
apparently she is going to do that. Kyle, what's your view on how much is going on?
I keep hearing this term fraud, and it reminds me back of the back to when we tried to save the special diet, and we were hearing that they were fraudulently using it, and it was the same reason, because the maximum amount right now is $489 for a one bedroom. Where in this city can you get $489 for a one bedroom? You can't. So people are using their special diets, and they got $250 special diet and supplementing their rent with it, and that's fraud to the government. Well, if the government didn't want us to be using the special diet towards our rent, then they need to give us enough money to pay our rent. And then we won't be using money else from other sources that we're supposed to be using for that. And we could use the special diet towards our food, and then we don't have to go to the food bank.
Okay, Sean, Minister McLeod said there are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fraud happening when it comes to social assistance payments. I don't know that she actually provided any evidence for that, but do we have any reason to believe that that's accurate?
I'm afraid I've not seen anything to that effect. And you aren't going to hear me defend the effectiveness or the efficiency of government. But where I do think these reforms may get at these issues, especially the extent to which they are inadvertent or because of the system's bureaucratic nature. I was just thinking as people were talking, I tried to get my driver's license renewed a couple of days ago and had a hard time. I can only imagine someone navigating this system, particularly with all of the other stresses that they're dealing with. And this is where I think this local orientation that the minister has spoken about, the greater role for local support, for individualized support, will hopefully help people navigate the system more seamlessly, more carefully, and avoid these types of issues, the extent to which they're happening.
One quick follow-up, again, and not wanting to get overly partisan here, but the Liberals, we have heard already, over the last 15 years, had their shares of failures on this system, but I think we can say at least they talked a gentler, kinder game on this. Conservatives are often accused of not only putting in bad policies that will hurt people on social assistance, but sort of enjoying it while they're doing it. That's the stereotypical accusation. You know, if you start saying there's hundreds of millions of dollars of welfare fraud going on out there and you don't have any evidence to back it up, are you really helping your brand as a kinder, gentler person?
It's such an important question, Steve, because I accept the premise that these perceptions exist. And what I like so much about the minister's speech was how aspirational it was, how committed to the success of these individuals she was. And so I don't quarrel with your argument that the extent to which we're talking about fraud, we need to bring evidence to bear. But what I think what differentiated this speech and what differentiates this program from the way that Conservatives have frequently talked about these types of issues was the extent to which it was aspirational, compassionate, focused on individuals and the dignity of work. I think this represents quite seriously a model for Conservative reform, not just across the provinces, but I think Conservatives in other jurisdictions will be looking at the way that the minister has spoken about this issue and the way in which it's informed the types of changes that she's talking about. I'm as excited about this package of Conservative reform that I've been about Conservative policy development in a long, long time.
Susan, I do have to say that much of the feedback that we've seen, for example, on the editorial pages of newspapers or columnists who are writing about this, the gist of it has been, boy, we were really expecting something horrible and very debilitating, and it's actually not as bad as we feared. Does that sum up relatively well how you feel about this?
Upon doing further reading into the topic, it does seem like a good plan. It does seem like they're taking it holistically. And as an Indigenous person, that is something that we do. When we go to any kind of, look at any kind of situation or problem, we like to just not look at the problem and how to fix it, but how it affects the whole person and the community. And this plan seems to be thinking that way, but right now it's just on paper. Until we can actually see this in action, then we'll see if it's working or not.
Kyle, is this not as bad as you feared?
It's to me, it's worse because at least with previous governments, we had a voice. We were consulted. We sat down, and they gave us examples of where they were planning on going and what could be the side effects or the downfalls of going this way. And we got to advocate. And this government did not meet with us at all.
Well, because they wanted to turn something around very quickly, so they may not have had time.
But they still could have met with us. We still would have met with them at any time to consult with them to at least
So tell me then, if you had had a chance to meet with the minister and she said, Kyle, tell me one thing I can do that will make things better, what would you have suggested? Well,
we talk about the employment. So, for example, I'm on no DSP only for extended health benefits. And that was something we advocated for in the past because there's a lot of people that are on ODSP that could be working, but there's things that might hold them back. So if you guarantee my medication coverage, then I might be able to work, which is what happens to me. But if you take away that medication now from me and I can't afford to pay my meds, I'm gonna now get sick and then I'm back on ODSP. So we need to have a system that worked fairly for people, that was individualized to their disability and to their need, right?
There was something kind of extraordinary that happened before this package was unveiled, and that is Hugh Siegel, who's obviously lifelong progressive conservative, has run for the party, has been a chief of staff to a former prime minister and a former premier. He asked an open question in an op-ed piece as to whether or not Premier Ford's For the People included poor people. His allegation was that this is a government that lacks compassion for poor people. What do you say to that?
I'd say the compassion that's in this announcement is that it didn't pull the rug out from people overnight. And I think, and the vision for OW looks good. Whether it's deliberate or inadvertent, I think the change in definition to disability completely undermines what they hope to do with OW. It's putting, you're going to have more people with long-term needs, often with lifelong needs, will now be on OW. So it stops being the program for people who need temporary assistance.
What about Sean's notion that at least the federal government and the provincial government are speaking the same language now and their definitions are aligned, which potentially allows for a bigger, more consistent approach?
The definition they're looking at is the Canada Pension Plan Disability Program. It's a different program, different objectives. It's for people who've been in the labor market for a very long time.
So wrong definition entirely.
Totally wrong definition. It's the bridge between disability and retirement. It doesn't work for the 25-year-old with a disability.
Let me give Deb Hutton the last 30 seconds here. Does the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party have a job to do to convince the broader public that it is compassionate to all the people?
Well, I don't want to end on a cliche here, Steve, but I'm going to. I fundamentally believe that the most compassionate thing you can do for a government through its social assistance program is to get people into productive employment. That, to me, is the very definition of compassion. Letting people be on social assistance year after year after year, generation after generation, is the least compassionate thing you could possibly do.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for coming into TVO tonight. We really appreciate you sharing your views on this most difficult topic. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.